own software? Okay, so a few of you. How many of you are using Meraki APIs? A couple fewer. Okay. Do you have Meraki environments? A few more people. Okay. All right. So the principles that we're going to talk about here, I've tailored to Meraki dashboard, but we'll go into some principles that are kind of applicable to other APIs that you might use, even from other vendors. So hopefully you'll find this rewarding. Couple more minutes before we get started. Yeah, let me just put this down here, actually. Can I put it in here? Okay, are you ready? Would you like to get started? Okay. So please make yourself comfortable, and we'll talk about some of the principles of efficiency and working with Meraki APIs. First, what is this about? I want working with Meraki APIs to be easy and positive and rewarding, right? Whether you're a network admin that knows a little bit about Python, or an ecosystem partner who's been working with other vendors and building solutions for a while now, I'm hoping to share with you some of the things we've learned from our customers and our partners and distill those insights into something that you can actually leverage when you're doing your development with Meraki APIs and otherwise. If you're looking to evaluate your current API consumption, maybe you don't understand what your applications are doing, you'll see some tools available in this talk that should make it a little bit more clear what's happening in your environment. And even if you're not hitting any API rate limits today, you'll have a better idea of how to build an efficient and effective application. We're going to go over a quick introduction, me and the dashboard API, the budgets, some frequent flyer issues that customers who are operating at very large scale frequently have and report, and why those things are happening, as well as a few new features that we've shipped so that you can start leveraging today, and finally, how to stay current on the developments that we are shipping. So who am I? I'm John Kuchta. I've been with Meraki for a few years now. My role is primarily in product strategy development, data science, and engineering consulting for Meraki Dashboard API and our other API products. If you find this talk rewarding, then please feel free to join my next talk tomorrow in the DevNet Theater, DevNet 1646. We're going to go into a little bit more strategy and kind of business OpEx concerns. And it's going to go a little bit deeper into software design and engineering management practices. So if you like what you see here today, feel free to join that session tomorrow. But for today's talk, let's get started, and let's start with the call budgets themselves. So what are API rate limits or call budgets, and why do we have them? So first of all, they define the number of API calls that you can actually make in a certain period of time, right? They are a safeguard against runaway applications, malicious behavior, and they help ensure performance for not just you, but for others using the services. And they help prevent things like DOS attacks and ensure reliability of the overall system. The best practice for any application using any API anywhere is to manage your API budgets effectively, right? Stay within them. The budgets are a hard limit on what you can do with the API. If you start hammering the API, whatever API, beyond those limits, you're just wasting time and resources, yours and theirs, especially if it's a cloud application and you're paying for that compute. So that applies to any API, not just Meraki's. As far as Meraki's go, what are the two major API call budgets? So the first one is per Meraki dashboard organization, 10 per second. There's a little bit of bursting involved. I'm going to leave that out for now. But that means that over the course of an entire day, you can make 864,000 API calls successfully. And for a customer who might be, or a developer who might be working with multiple organizations, you can actually make 100 API calls per source IP address. So if you're managing 3 or 4 different applications from a single source IP address, combined, they have a 100 requests per second budget, regardless of the organizations that we're working in. It's easy to tell when you're being rate limited because we send a 429 response code. So if you see the 429, we'll also send you a retry after header. That's the simplest way to avoid 429s and rate limiting in general, is to listen to us when we say, wait this long before you try again. So what are the frequent flyers when we're working with some of these challenges? Well, the first is misunderstanding the nature of the network environment, right? And so this is sometimes tough for a software developer. It's a little bit easier for the networking people working in that environment, right? What do I mean by that? Is it a day zero environment? Is there lots of rapid provisioning and things changing very, very quickly because things are still getting stood up or being fixed? Is there an outage where there might be some remediation action happening? That's going to influence, and it should influence how your application operates in that environment, right? If it's not changing very frequently, then you probably shouldn't be asking, have things changed very frequently, right? And so an example there is in the dashboard organization, you have a number of networks, and each network corresponds to usually a physical location. Well, in some cases, we've had applications hit that API endpoint, get organization networks 100,000 times in a single day for a single organization. And there's really just no reason for that, right? Especially in an environment that is like day 2, day 3, right? That list of networks is really not going to change even 100 times a day, let alone 100,000. So yeah, you can do it, and you've got budget to do it, but you're wasting your time, and your application could be more efficient if you take that into account. So again, developers often lack the context to know what to expect from a network environment. And if you understand what to expect from the network itself, then it'll be a little bit easier to build an efficient application in that environment. Let's look at another frequent flyer. Lack of coordination between teams and developers. This has nothing to do with Meraki, to be clear, and it happens to every single development team anywhere, large and small. This is one of the biggest reasons, because different teams might be making conflicting changes at the same time, right? So if you're deciding that, okay, we're going to overhaul all of the VLAN configs, and you're going to do it on a maintenance window, and you've got another team that says, okay, well, we're going to change all the subnets, for example, at the same time. Well, there's probably going to be some conflicting changes happening during that maintenance window, and if those teams aren't talking to each other, you're going to end up redoing configs over and over again, because there will still not be, a source of truth that you expect. And that's something that you'll encounter with really any system, right? So teams should be communicating with each other. Now, this doesn't just include the kind of developers that are working within an organization. It also applies to ecosystem partners. If you're building a solution for other customers, like, so if you're one of our ecosystem partners, or you're just building a third-party solution and you're selling that software to our mutual customers, then you should be doing a few things to help communicate as well what's going on with your application. And one of those things is give some estimates as to how much API budget your application is going to consume, right? That's not always very fun to do, because sometimes you need to consume quite a bit. But if you at least let people know and set some expectations in advance, this is how much I'm going to use, then at least there's an understanding, okay, that this is normal behavior in the environment. And additionally, if you are operating in an environment, you should probably be sending a user agent string with every API request. That's very important, so that the customers who are auditing their API usage understand that it's your application that's doing the thing. It's your application that's creating that new dashboard organization admin. If they don't know what the application is, then it looks suspicious, and it doesn't really reflect well on you as an application developer. But beyond that, if you are an ecosystem partner, you're being introduced to a new environment, and you need to deal with some contention over the API budget, it's very hard to know what is going on and tell a story around that unless other developers are doing the same, right? So communicating, whether you are a developer working for a single customer or an ecosystem partner, can make a big difference here. And when they're auditing the API consumption, it makes that a lot more efficient a process. Another frequent flyer here, missing out on some of the more efficient APIs. So there are lots of ways to skin a cat, as it were. And if you search for an API in our documentation site and you find one that seems relevant to what you want to do, sometimes it's easy to stop there and say, okay, I found what I need. I'm going to go and build my application based on that one API endpoint. You might have missed, for example, that there are more efficient applications geared towards your use case. And so that's where there's a little bit of research involved. And we want to make the research easy, but this also takes a little bit of discipline in looking and examining the different tools that we have available in the documentation site that do things like aggregate client side, that aggregate data on the server side so that you don't have to do it client side, right? So a couple examples here. Get device is an API endpoint that returns the metadata for a single Meraki device. You can imagine if you have 100,000 devices, calling it 100,000 times kind of seems inefficient, and it is very inefficient because we have other calls like get organization devices, which will pull all of the organization devices information in an aggregate API response. So this is 1,000x more efficient than calling one per device. You have if you had 100,000 devices in a single organization, you can get 1,000 per API call. So it'd be 100 API calls instead of 100,000, right? So 1,000x improvement if you use the right tool for the job. There's lots of examples for this that unfortunately we don't have too much time to go into. There'll be a few others we look at, but this is one of the biggest principles. There's also this concept of a network scoped application, or network scoped feature or configuration. And we have other aggregates at the organization level for those as well. We call that process upscoping, where you're taking something that's defined at a lower scope, like a device or a network, and aggregating that, keeping that level of detail, but aggregating it so you can get it at the organization level. So those features are available. So a couple things to keep in mind here. If you're going to build a really excellent solution, you should be using the best tool for the job. Now, generally, that means using the best dashboard API for the job, but there are other tools available to you. So if you are building, for example, a monitoring application, Dashboard API is probably just the start of the story. We have a rich set of webhooks features where you can take push alerts from the Meraki dashboard, integrate that into your application. And as you can imagine, that's a lot more efficient than asking, are we there yet? Because we will let you know when something happens that is relevant. So that can be much more efficient. I had an ecosystem partner come in and ask, okay, we would like to build an application that looks at a ton of RSSI and client information. We'd like to get this on a really high frequency. We are worried that doing it in Dashboard API is going to be kind of inefficient. That is true, actually, in this case. But we offer something called Scanning API, where you just tell us where you want us to push that data. And then every minute, we'll send you things like client information, triangulations on where they are, RSSI information, which radios they're able to hear, or where we're able to hear them, etc. So these tools, there are other tools for the job. Using the best tool for the job is really the takeaway here. If you're doing provisioning, right? So stepping back from telemetry, if you're doing provisioning, building your application, you use something that's called action batches. This is a Meraki specific tool. Action batches can make your operation about 100x more efficient because you can take any configurations that you need to push, bundle them into a single action, and now 100 at a time, you can say, I want all of these things to happen. And then you send that to us. We treat it atomically, so we'll only commit the changes if all of them succeed. That's much, much more efficient. You can take a deployment of like 200,000 devices potentially across many, many sites and get it done in a matter of hours rather than weeks, right? So that's even if you're building really highly optimized. If you're not using action batches, you can take it the next level with action batches for provisioning. Frankly, these things are relevant, right? Because developers aren't always aware or up to date on what the net new API operations are, right? So that's something that it may be actually easier for the networking teams that are working with those developers to help them with. One of the ways that you can actually do this more efficiently is a use case called configuration auditing. Has anyone here audited a configuration before? Okay, I see some heads nodding. So as you can imagine, if you need to go and pull 100 pieces of configuration information, maybe for thousands of devices, that can be pretty efficient, pretty inefficient and laborious. So what's one way that you can be more efficient there? Well, instead of just asking for all of the configs and then doing the diff yourself, you can ask Meraki, have any of the configs changed in the entire organization, right? So if nothing's changed since the last time you actually established like a golden config and stored that locally, then you already have the most up-to-date information, right? You can save yourself thousands of API calls just by checking, did anything change? And if nothing changed, right? So this can make your application much more efficient. What are we doing for time here? Let's take a look at auditing API usage. Some of the tools that can help you understand what's going on in your environment. If you have Meraki dashboard today, if you're using our systems, even if you're not a developer, if you are curious what applications are using the API in my environment, then these are some tools that you can use to understand that. So the first one is called Get Organization API Requests. It's pretty straightforward. I know that text might be a little small, but you can just see the history of API requests made against your organization, successful or otherwise, right? So if it's rate limited, it would say response code 429, right? In this particular example, it was successful. But there's a couple key pieces of information that you can unpack here, and you can do it on a per request basis, right? This is pretty valuable even if you're processing hundreds of thousands of API requests a day. This data set is filterable, but the key pieces of information that you can pull out of this to understand what's going on: admin ID. Admin ID is the ID of the admin whose API key is being used to make the call. So if you're wondering who is giving access to this application, it's coming from the admin with that ID. The method just tells you, are they making a change? Are they pulling some information, right? So that's an HTTP action. That's a get, delete, post, update, whatever, right? The path is the full path of the API operation. But what you're probably going to want to look at instead is the operation ID at the bottom. And that tells you what is the name of the API operation that they are calling. So what are they doing? Well, in this example, they're calling get organization API request. They're looking at this same operation, right? Now, whatever they're doing in the environment, you will be able to see what they are doing with this log, right? Even if, by the way, you have some runaway application and your API budget's being completely consumed, right? You will still be able to call these endpoints that I'm going to talk about for auditing API usage. So if you feel like you're getting blocked out of your environment for whatever reason, you can still use these successfully and not get rate limited to find out what's going on. Now this is going to be basically newest first, right? So when you look at it, it's going to be a huge index of requests that are happening in your environment, or maybe if nothing's been called, it'll be an empty array. But you'll be able to filter this by source IP of the application. So maybe you're wondering, was that the application we've got running in AWS, et cetera. So that said, this gives you a lot of detail, right, to understand what's happening in your environment. That level of detail might be a little bit difficult to work with at scale. So we have another one, get organization API requests overview. And what this is telling you is a summary for a given time span, last, 30 days maybe. What were all the response codes, the counts of response codes for everything that was happening in that time span? This is also filterable, right? If you want to filter this down to a single admin ID or a single user agent string or that type of thing, you can do that. But it will tell you, for example, that in this case, you had 500, 200 OK responses. Now, when you look at this at the big picture, it gives you a kind of bird's eye view as to how are things operating, right? You might look at this and see that everything in this response is a 200, and then it's maybe zeros down the bottom, right? Meaning that everything's succeeding, right? There are no issues here. And so you might stop your audit there because there's not really an obvious sign that you need to do anything else. But if you have specific issues like, why are we getting like all these 403 forbiddens, then this will give you a little bit of insight into that as well. One of the newer features that we've shipped recently takes this and tries to present it a little bit more elegantly and in a way that's a little bit more intuitive. So it's called Get Organization API Requests Overview Response Codes by Interval. Now, that is a mouthful, but hopefully just from the name, you can get an idea of what the API operation does. And in this case, even though there's only one entry here, it will tell you for a start timestamp and an end timestamp what happened in that particular interval of time, right? So you might say, okay, I want to look back at the last 7 days. Show me what happened every day, right? And in this case, between these two timestamps, which is a single day, there were 199,200 OK codes and nothing else. Meaning, again, everything succeeded. So there's not really any sign of an issue here. And if that API volume is kind of what you expect from the applications, because you already have some context on what your applications are doing, then you might stop there. But this might also tell you a very different story, right? It might say instead of 200,000 200s, it might say 200,000 429s. In which case, okay, what's happening, right? Again, a 429 is not like a useful response to incur, right? Every time you get a 429, you've wasted effort in some way, right? So this will help you get an idea of what's going on in the environment. Now, to make this more powerful, I showed you before, I'll go back 2 slides, these pieces of metadata, admin ID, method, query string, user agent, response code, etc. Operation ID, especially. The endpoint that's the by interval endpoint is filterable by something like an operation ID. So if you're wondering, okay, well, what's happening with people getting organization networks or getting network clients, you can filter this down to just that narrower view to see if there's other optimizations that you can make. Now let's talk about a few of the new features that you might not be taking advantage of that we've shipped that can help make your life easier when you're operating in a very large environment, whether you're an ecosystem partner building an application for our mutual customers, or you are a customer or a service provider, etc. So the first one is called, another mouthful here, but also hopefully very explicit, get organization devices uplinks addresses by device. I will try tomorrow. Get organization devices uplinks addresses by device. Would anyone like to raise their hand and tell me what they think this API operation does? It's a safe space. So, okay. How many people feel like they kind of know what it probably does? Few people. Okay. So that's good. As you probably imagined, it gives you all the IPAM information for all the devices in an organization, right? So what are they using for their uplinks, right? What are they using for management? This applies to IPv4 and IPv6. So if you have an IPAM use case, or you just need to know how is everything connecting, well, you can do that in aggregate across all of your devices in an organization pretty easily. And I really like this API because it's pretty human readable as well, right? You've got the MAC address of the device, which is what it's going to use to do a DHCP request, right, on your LAN, or to your service provider if it's an MX, for example, right? It tells you what network it in. It tells you what kind of product it is. In this case, it's a switch. Gives you the serial number. So if you're bringing something into your CMDB, right, you can record that. And it also tells you the uplinks. Now, some devices have multiple uplinks. So one of the types of devices that has multiple uplinks is an MX, which has WAN 1, WAN 2, and cellular, right? But then there's also devices like switches that can have alternate management interfaces. And so they have multiple uplinks in that sense as well. And all this address information is contained in this array on a per interface basis. So in this case, the example is actually a little strange because it says interface WAN 1 for a switch, which you will not actually see in practice. That should actually say product type appliance for a WAN 1. And in this case, it's showing you the addresses as an array. The protocol is IPv6, and everything here is pretty human readable. It tells you it's a statically assigned IPv6 address. And it works for all the Meraki devices that have IP addresses, right? So MT devices are IoT sensors. Those don't have IP addresses. They're Bluetooth only, but everything else has an IP address, and you will get it in this. This is a lot more efficient than going to each device and saying, okay, what's your IP address or what's your alternate management interface? A lot more efficient. Another one I'm really proud of, another mouthful, get organization devices availabilities change history. So how many of you in any network anywhere have been concerned with, are my devices online or offline? I would presume it's everybody. And when you're asking, okay, is it online in Meraki dashboard today? A lot of people will do something like get organization devices statuses, right? Which again is a pretty straightforward API operation. And it gives you the status of all your devices right now, right? You make the call, it says, yeah, it's online right now. But if you're doing this on a regular basis, right, you probably don't want to have to ask every 5 minutes, is it online? Is it online? Is it online? Pretty inefficient. And for a long time, that was the only way to do it with the API, right? So we're sorry, but this makes it a lot easier. So what are we doing here? So we're taking the statuses and we're showing you how they change over time, right? Instead of just showing you what is it right now. So you might go and pull the statuses for all your devices and say, okay, I know that I've got 100 devices online, 10 offline, etc. And then from that point in time, you've got a state of the network. From that timestamp to the next hour, you might ask, did anything change in that time span? And if it didn't, you will get an empty response, right? An empty response will mean there were no changes. So 0 data indicating all good, right? Nothing's changed at least. And this is a lot more efficient than going through however many hundreds of thousands of devices and asking, is it online, is it not, right? Your data, if you're keeping that state in your application, this is much, much more efficient. The other thing that it does is it tells you not just that it changed, but it also tells you the new and the old, right? So here it says the old status was online and the new status is offline. Uh-oh. Why did that MR34 go offline, right? Well, that's a problem for the network admin to solve, right? But we're at least telling you that this device is no longer reachable, and this is when that thing happened, right? And it's part of this network, and it's a wireless access point, for example. So this can be much, much more efficient. You can also filter this operation, by the way. So if you don't, maybe you're not on the wireless team, so you don't want to see all the change events for wireless access points, or maybe you're dealing with a broadcast storm or something, and so you know certain types of devices are going to be affected by that, and you need to cut through the noise, focus on something else that is relevant to your job. You can filter this by the product types, for example. So you can say, you know, just show me the MXs. That's the only thing that I care about. An example of where we've done this for some of the older configs is get organization switch ports by switch. So if you've ever pulled port configurations for a Meraki switch, you've probably noticed that you have to drill down to the device level and say, show me all your port configs. And if you have 100,000 switches, that's 100,000 API calls, and no one likes doing that. So this aggregates that data, maintains the level of detail, of course, but it aggregates that data to an organization-wide API call. So if you want to see all of the port configs, then it will show you the switches across your entire organization, and within that entity, the ports config. So you get the ports config information across. Okay, so great question. So let's do a little tangent here. I think we have time. How are we on time? Yeah. Okay. So the question was, does it work for Catalyst 9300 or does it work for the other Catalyst devices in Meraki dashboard? So principle on that. Everything that we're shipping in Meraki dashboard, by default, we expect to support both platforms from a switch perspective, right? So if it's MS and Catalyst, we want it to support both. There are some cases where the feature might be Catalyst exclusive, so you might see a Catalyst exclusive API, but for the common functionality, we want common APIs, right? So this one should already be working for Catalyst switches. Yeah. Correct. Yeah. So the question was, does it have to be a fully managed in Meraki dashboard device if it's a Catalyst device, or can it be in monitor only mode? Yes, it can be in monitor only mode. Yeah. Now, whether or not this particular feature supports Catalyst devices, and this is true for really anything, right, can depend on the capabilities, right? So you can imagine that a Catalyst port config might be a little more complex than a Meraki switch config, right? So if there are differences there, then there may be other tools to get that information. But the principle remains the same. Great question. Thank you. So let's talk about how to stay current. So if you are developing applications, if you are consuming applications, or if you are just curious about what applications are doing in your environment, how can you stay up to date? The one that is, I think, most relevant to most people is Meraki.io. This is a website. It's our documentation site. Here you can find, for example, our release notes for every API release. We release a new API revision. We've recently updated the language revision every month. So every month there is some number of new features or revisions, new capabilities in the API. If the last time you looked at what was new was 6 months ago, then 6 months of changes you've probably missed, right? Now those revisions, that's important language because revision is a non-breaking change, right? It's the still same dashboard V1 API, but those revisions they're additive, right? So they are non-breaking. So you can see the full list of everything that we're releasing, as well as a summarized what's new section, as well as our API documentation site and search features. We've done some augmentations here as well. So previously, one of the pieces of feedback we got pretty frequently was, I would like to find a very specific piece of information, and it's kind of hard to find in the documentation site where that is, right? Well, now in the documentation site, if you have the name of an attribute and you're wondering where does it exist in the API, for example, maybe you're wondering where can I find some LLDP information, you can just type in LLDP into the search, right? And it won't just give you the API operation, which is get device LLDP CDP, which as you can imagine, gives you that discovery information, the topology information discovered by a single device. It will also show you, for example, get network topology link layer, if I've got that correct. And that is for all of the devices in a single network, what's all of the discovery information that we have, CDP, LLDP, or otherwise. And that's, again, another example of how you can do things much more efficiently. Rather than looking at LLDP information on a per device basis, you can ask, what's the whole topology for the network? And we'll give you that in a single response. The Meraki Community Developer Forum is a great place to ask questions and actually have conversations with other developers. So we do, at Meraki, engage in these forums ourselves, PMs like me and others, Meraki employees as well who may not be PMs on the API team, but just SEs from other parts of the business. Lots of people participate here, as do lots of other developers, including ecosystem partners who help bring that perspective and knowledge into the forum. So usually someone else has given an answer before we even get to it. So we're pretty proud of that. Community.meraki.com is a great place to stay current on your APIs. So let's wrap up. And we might have time for Q&A. Are we at, is it 15? Okay, maybe not. You can find me after, by the way, if you have any questions. So let's recap. When you're trying to build efficient software in the Meraki API, the nature of the environment, day 0, day 2, et cetera, should inform the way your application is going to operate in that environment, right? If you treat a day 2 environment like a day 0 environment, you're probably wasting time. If you treat a day 0 environment like a day 2 environment, you might be missing some relevant events and details, right? So get an idea of what the network kind of maturity is, right? Is it stable state? Is it not? That will really help your application be efficient. Next, communicate. Now, this is something that kind of applies to any team anywhere, right? But it bears repeating, especially if you are in the trenches writing the code or in the trenches troubleshooting an issue. Communicating across teams is really essential here. So you understand who else is working, for example, in a single maintenance window. And then if you're building an application, whether it's a script, whether it's an actual ecosystem application, send your user agent string. We have guidance on the Meraki.io website that explains how to format a great user agent string so that you can be transparent with your customers, the environments you're working in. Yes, this was me, right? Even if you're an amateur network admin, right? The people who might be auditing API usage at some point would probably benefit from knowing, oh, this was John in there doing his job, right? And what happens sometimes, right, is that something goes amok, total mistake, but at least it's easier to lock that down and say, okay, we can do something to remediate. So if you're managing a team, or if you're evaluating an ecosystem partner application or even a third-party application outside of the ecosystem, it's fair to expect that they send this user agent string with every API call. If you're having problems with scale, you might not be using the most efficient tool for the job. We talked about a few of the APIs that are upscoped, right? Call things in aggregate rather than on a per resource basis. This can be 1,000x more efficient in many, many cases. And staying on top of new feature releases, because we are building new features, even for some very, very old things like switchport configs. We are releasing these things to make it easier to get that state of the network, whether it's telemetry or configurations. Staying on top of that can help you make your applications more efficient. And finally, and this is kind of just a best practice, right? If you're the one who owns a Meraki environment, you probably want to be auditing your API usage every once in a while. Now, if nothing's on fire, okay, maybe you might not have much incentive. But as soon as you're bringing in a new ecosystem partner, as soon as you're bringing in a new solution, you probably want to do a little bit of this before and after, right? To see what's going on in your environment and how your budgets have changed. So with that said, I think we are at time. I have a Meet the Expert session. So if you'd like, find me on the session catalog and sign up for that. Please send a survey on the session. Hopefully this was valuable to you. This really helps us give you targeted content that is actually relevant and helpful. And you can get a t-shirt. Also, please head over to the Cisco networking group and grab a conversation with the ecosystem team. They have a demo situation, and you can enter for the chance to win an NV63 camera and the licenses. So please do join us there. And of course, there's other options for continuing, like I mentioned with Meet the Expert. And we have a raffle. And the raffle is for Echo Spot. Okay. Oh, I'm in charge of this? Oh, okay. Should I pick the one that's folded? I won't. Uh-oh. Oh, they didn't put their name, but I should just read the number, right? Okay. So 346 1 1. Who's at this point? Who's still in the running here? Raise your hand. 9. You got it. Congratulations. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming to my session. I'll be over here if you have any questions for a little bit. And that is it. Thank you.